Over the weekend, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg shared a mystifying video of himself on an electric surfboard celebrating the 4th of July. The internet, of course, reacted with edits of their own and various memes.
Democratic strategist and SVP for Firehouse Strategies, Michael Starr Hopkins, and senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, Inez Stepman, are here to weigh in. And so what was so wild about this is that what comes immediately after is something we want to put up here for you, that Arami Osei Frimpong, also known as the Funky Academic, who is a friend of this show, ends up with what at first started as a 7-day Facebook ban for quoting the Declaration of Independence. It has since evolved into a 30-day ban because he appealed it. They claim that he violated the community standards on hate speech by quoting the portion of the Declaration of Independence that references slave revolts and wars with Native Americans. I DM'd with Arami about his ban, and here's what he had to say about it. I guess that it is hate speech, but it's written by Jefferson. Did I break the rules by posting the Declaration of Independence because it's hate speech? Yes. Should we be in the business of banning historical documents because those documents include hate speech? I don't think so. Which means that we need to think about how rules are actually used versus how we talk about them. And then he adds, yes, I'm still banned. So, Michael, what do you think triggered the robot here to ban Arami for 7 days and then follow up with a 30-day ban? Which element of his post do you think triggered them the most?
I gotta admit, I have no idea, and it's why I don't even have Facebook anymore. Social media has gotten so toxic and weird, and Zuckerberg has just gotten, I think, so evil in terms of his mining of people's data and his ability to influence governments, that I think we all need to really take a step back and think about whether Facebook and the like are actually good for social construction anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting because Zuckerberg, and I'm glad Ryan sort of tied these together, because it would be easy just to dunk on Zuckerberg for that ridiculous video, but it is fascinating to see him sort of, he's out there waving the American flag, he's enjoying his 4th of July. This is something he published publicly, which if you are a very powerful billionaire like Mark Zuckerberg, you don't just do. It's not just on a whim. This is something that was like calculated and very deliberate, while his own platform's algorithm is picking up on things. Presumably it was the capital S savages in the Declaration of Independence.
It also could have been the word insurrection. And
true.
So this particular grievance in the Declaration of Independence refers to two specific things that they're blaming King George for doing. And one is they say fomenting insurrections. They don't say who he's fomenting insurrections among.
Right.
But what they mean is that the UK, as part of its policy to keep settlers in check, was occasionally inspiring slave revolts.
Yeah.
And a year before the Declaration of Independence, Lord Dunmore in North Carolina said that, look, if any enslaved people escape from their settler concentration camp, their settler plantation, and fight with the British against the rebels, then the UK will give them their freedom. That backfired on Dunmore in the sense that it really helped galvanize support for revolution. So it could have been the word insurrection. Facebook is a little sensitive about the January 6th one, or it could have been savages, which I've heard of people who've been banned for the word saying that just like something was savage,
right?
And the robot just picks that up and it's like, you're nuked.
And so, Inez, let's take that either way. Let's say it's either one of those possibilities. What does this tell us about Facebook? I mean, is this just some sort of like little glitch where the algorithm accidentally swept something in that wasn't supposed to be swept in, or does this speak to much broader problems with the platform's attempt to sort of police speech?
Of course, it speaks to the larger problem of policing speech when you are censoring the Declaration of Independence as hate speech, or first of all, no matter how you feel about those passages in the Declaration, they are part of our history. We have to read them and learn from them instead of memory holding them. But actually, the first thing that popped into my mind with regard to this is how Huckleberry Finn, for example, has been pulled from a lot of school curriculums. Unfortunately, I realize that one is a social media platform, a private social media platform. The other is public school curriculum. But we do have to have a discussion. Every society has taboos, has limits on what is considered within the realm of appropriate discussion in politics. Every society has that. But what's happened is we've outsourced that discussion either to bureaucracies in the case of schools, very often people who are unelected, not the local school board. And then in the case of social media platforms, we outsource it to private companies, whereas that conversation about who we are as a people needs to actually happen within the realm of democracy, within politics. And so that's what I find most worrying about all of these kinds of bans. And I frankly, I do like this video, even though, it's kind of irrelevant. But I do like the video, even though it's kind of like one of those AI bots that you say, oh, read 100 America ! Posts and like generate something, content for the internet. I kind of enjoy it anyway. But I'd prefer that he substantively embraces the principles of free speech, even though it's his private company.
Right, and Michael, there appears to be some hypocrisy or contradiction at work, and I don't exactly know how to disentangle it, and I'd be curious for your take. But on the one hand, Facebook's business model is to drive engagement by getting people angry at each other, because that's what gets, flame wars are what fuel the entire business model. So they want people angry, but if you get too angry, then you're nuked. So they want to push people right up to the line, and they have pushed obviously millions of people over the line. But if your whole business model is getting people angry, then how do you rein it in by just looking for a couple of words that if you say these few words, well, now you've gone too far? Isn't the business model the problem?
Well, I think that the problem is they're worried about lawsuits. There has been so much rhetoric that's been inflammatory and so many actions that have been done because of the behavior that's been perpetrated on Facebook, whether it be people committing violence against each other, whether it be insurrection, whether it be domestic violence. I think what Facebook is really worried about is they've kind of let the genie out of the bottle to some degree, and they fired people up on their platform, and there have been consequences for it. And one of the big worries is that a court will make them liable for that conduct. And so I think what they're trying to do is find some sort of balance between continuing to fire up their readers or their platform users while also attempting at least to stop any civil liability.
Yeah, I think that's getting exactly at it, in that they didn't realize they would stumble into these situations where they ended up needing to be regulated. So their speech policies turn into this complete haphazard, inconsistent mess that censors the Declaration of Independence, which obviously is something that's well worth public conversation. So Inez, the question then is, where do we go from here? What is the right decision for Facebook? I would say drop just about every speech regulation that they have on their platform, but they don't want to do that because it wouldn't allow them to exist anymore. Essentially, they would be getting hammered constantly by lawmakers, even more than they are now. So what do they do?
Look, I think what Michael mentioned about fear of lawsuits, I kind of wish that were true. The reality is that these companies are exempt from the normal kinds of liability lawsuits, which to some degree was absolutely necessary to build the internet. If you can imagine, the platform is responsible every time a user, for example, posts a child pornography image, which was actually the purpose of a lot of this legislation, was to allow these platforms to take down some of the more vicious forms of pornography. But what we've seen is they're now very much in the game of editing political speech. And again, I think it behooves us as a country to talk about, if there are going to be, I think there are inevitably boundaries placed on speech, even in the United States, which has the most robust free speech sort of protections, even among other, sort of countries that we think of as free or liberal countries, like European countries and so on. There are always limitations on speech, but the question is, who is forming those limitations? Are we arguing about them within the context of the First Amendment and our body politic and democracy? Or are we talking about a private company with an enormous amount of power deciding what does go in and what doesn't go into the public square and what we are allowed to talk and debate about? I think that that's really the question ahead of us. There are a lot of different solutions. I know Rachel Bovard, Vivek Ramaswamy, they've proposed some solutions, everything from refining that or revising that Section 230 protection for liability that Michael was talking about, all the way to antitrust, to applying antitrust laws against some of these companies. I don't think that would be likely to work against Facebook, because Facebook, it does not meet the traditional definition of a monopoly, but there might be some other applications, for example, to Google. But
right.
I think we're kind of sticking stuff, throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. But I think there is a broad recognition that these companies have too much power over our discourse.
I think it probably does. You could argue it does meet the definition of an old school monopoly, but even if it doesn't, then that's why we need legislation to make sure it does. The problem I have with thinking about this as a free speech issue is that it's not entirely free, in the sense that if you post something thoughtful and nuanced, Facebook is going to suppress that. Mm-hmm. Facebook is going to make sure nobody sees that. If you post something that's attacking your neighbor, Facebook is going to make sure that your neighbor sees that. If your neighbor logs on one day and misses it, the next day your neighbor logs on, they put it right back in front of their face until the neighbor has finally done what Facebook needs them to do, which is comment and fight back against them. And so then they're warring with each other. And so since it's not actually kind of free and neutral, then I think that they do need some sort of regulation, because if you have this algorithm that fuels hate without regulation, it would just dissolve into like the nastiest toxic pit you can imagine.
Well, and just to wrap everything up, I mean, I think what makes that different is the fact that they're doing all of that as a monopoly, so they're not responsive to consumers. Right. So if consumers clearly increasingly despise the algorithm doing that, but Facebook's not really responsive to that because they have so much monopoly power and they're convinced it's the way to sustain their business.
Yes, they are. Well, we'll have more Rising for you after this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glenn Greenwald is joining us next.